Ford built this Mustang on their main assembly line, then shipped it to a completely different factory to finish it, because the engine they designed for it was physically too big to fit. By the end of this investigation, you'll know the name of the man who accidentally named this car while trying to keep it secret, why the very first Boss 429 ever built took 50 years to find, and the specific engineering decision that made this Mustang slower than the cheaper version it was supposed to replace. Ford took their most powerful engine, paid a specialty contractor to hand rebuild each car around it, charged customers nearly double the base Mustang price, and the result was a car that lost to cheaper, simpler Mustangs in a straight line. So why would anyone pay more for less? And why would Ford build it in the first place? The answer has nothing to do with the street. It never did. To understand the Boss 429, you need to understand one of the most dramatic executive moves in American automotive history. In February 1968, Ford Motor Company hired Semon Bunkie Knudsen as its new president. Knudsen was a legend. He'd spent his career at General Motors, where he'd built Pontiac into a performance powerhouse, and was widely expected to eventually run the company. Knudsen brought someone with him, Larry Shinoda, one of the most talented automotive designers in the country, who had designed the Corvette Stingray at GM. Shinoda arrived at Ford and immediately began working on a series of high-performance Mustang variants under conditions of extreme secrecy. The Boss name came from Larry. When asked by colleagues what the secretive project he was working on was, Shinoda would jokingly say, "The Boss's car," a reference to his boss, Bunkie Knudsen, Ford's recently hired president. The name was never meant to be permanent, it was a deflection, and it stuck. The 429 cubic inch V8 that Knudsen and Shinoda were building the Boss around was not a refined street engine that happened to be large. It was a purpose-built NASCAR racing engine that happened to be installed in a street car, conceived not as a showroom flagship or a reliable workhorse, but as a mandatory vessel for NASCAR homologation. This shotgun motor was a massive, semi-hemispherical headed 429 cubic inch beast. Because the engine bay of a standard Mustang was physically too narrow to accommodate the behemoth, Ford contracted Kar Kraft to perform radical surgery on the chassis, hand-modifying engine compartments to cradle a racing engine never intended for street use. The modification process was extensive. Shock towers were widened, the battery was relocated to the trunk, and suspension geometry was revised. The air conditioning was removed entirely. A smaller brake booster was fitted to create clearance. A sway bar was added as standard equipment for the first time in Mustang history, because the weight of the engine over the front wheels required it. The cars were shipped to Kar Kraft's new assembly plant in Brighton, Michigan for engine installation and further modifications. Each car was hand-finished individually. Ford's main assembly line, one of the most sophisticated manufacturing operations in the world, could not complete its own product. The company Ford chose to hand-finish the Boss 429 wasn't a random contractor. It was the same organization responsible for one of the greatest motorsport achievements in history. Kar Kraft was a specialty contractor in Brighton, Michigan, already known for its work on racing Fords, including the legendary Le Mans dominating Ford GT40. The Ford GT40 won the 24 Hours of Le Mans 4 consecutive times, 1966, 1967, 1968, and 1969. It ended Ferrari's decade of dominance at the most prestigious endurance race in the world. The car that accomplished this was built and prepared by the same operation now being asked to cut apart street Mustangs and rebuild them around an engine that was too large for Ford's own factory to install. Think about what that means for a moment. The most sophisticated racing fabricators Ford had access to, the people who built Le Mans winners, were spending their days in a Brighton, Michigan facility relocating batteries to trunks and widening shock towers on production Mustangs. A Kar Kraft crew assembled on January 15, 1969 for a photo op with the first production Boss 429, a car immortalized in a black and white shot as Job 1. For 50 years, the location of Job 1 was unknown. In June 2019, the search ensued, and only 2 months later, Ford Authority reported details of the first ever Boss 429's history had been uncovered. In November 2021, Peterson Automotive Museum posted a video of Job 1 on the floor. The first Boss 429 ever built spent decades lost. The people who built it had also built Le Mans winners, and Ford's official position was that none of this was worth advertising. Here is the regulatory math that forced Ford's hand. NASCAR's homologation rules for 1969 required manufacturers to produce a minimum number of street-legal versions of any engine they wanted to race. The specific requirement, 500 units. Ford needed at least 500 Boss 429 Mustangs to exist as street cars before the 429 engine could legally compete in NASCAR. Total production for the first year was 859 units, with the following year seeing only 499 more, the minimum required by NASCAR homologation rules. The 1969 overproduction above 500 was Ford's insurance against quality issues and allocation shortfalls. The 1970 run was cut to the absolute minimum the moment homologation was secured. Every single one of those 1,358 cars across both model years passed through Kar Kraft's Brighton facility. Every single one was hand modified, and every single one was sold to a public that, for the most part, had no idea they were buying a NASCAR homologation vehicle, not a purpose-designed street performance car. The dealers selling them knew, the buyers rarely did. By this point in our investigation, you may recognize a familiar pattern. Ford officially rated the engine at 375 horsepower, but enthusiasts and historians argue the real output was closer to 500 horsepower, a 125 horsepower gap between the official rating and real-world output. The same insurance-driven underrating we documented on the L88 Corvette and the Oldsmobile 442 W30. By 1969, this was simply how American manufacturers operated. Insurance companies were pricing performance cars out of the reach of younger buyers based on published horsepower figures. The solution across every manufacturer was identical: publish a number low enough to keep premiums manageable, build an engine powerful enough to win races, and hope nobody put the two facts together. Across 2 model years of a car with total production of 1,358 units, each one hand-installed in a separate facility by the people who built Le Mans winners. Ford's accountants and NASCAR's rulebook were running this program. The engineers were just trying to keep up. The Boss 429 lasted exactly 2 model years, 1969 and 1970. The 1970 model marked the final year, with only 499 units built. The reasons for its disappearance converged from multiple directions simultaneously. Insurance costs were crushing demand for high-performance cars across the entire industry. Emissions regulations were beginning to bite into compression ratios and power output. Ford's racing program priorities shifted, and Bunky Knudsen, the man who had brought Shinoda from GM and initiated the entire Boss program, was fired by Henry Ford II in September 1969, less than 18 months after being hired, before the 1970 Boss 429 even reached showrooms. The program that Knudsen had created outlasted him by 1 model year, then quietly ended. Today, the rarity and mystique behind the Boss 429 has pushed values at auction well beyond $200,000. The earliest S-Code examples, the most race specification variant, hand-built in the first weeks of Kar Kraft's production run, have sold for significantly more. A documented numbers-matching Boss 429 with its original engine, transmission, and paint is among the most sought-after American muscle cars that can be purchased at any price point under 7 figures. A car Ford built because NASCAR made them, that their own factory couldn't finish, that was slower than the car it was supposed to replace, is now worth 50 times its original purchase price. We opened with a question: why would Ford ship a partially built car 60 miles to a separate facility to be finished by hand? Now you have the full answer. The engine was too large for the factory was too conventional for the engine, and the entire production run existed not because Ford wanted to sell street Mustangs, but because NASCAR's rulebook required them to. Bunky Knudsen and Larry Shinoda built a race car. Kar Kraft, the Le Mans fabricators, turned it into something you could technically register and drive to work. Ford's marketing team gave it a name that was never supposed to stick, and 1,358 buyers across 2 model years paid double the base Mustang price for a car that was slower than what they could have bought for half the money. If you've been following the L88 Corvette and the Superbird investigations on this channel, you already know the pattern. The Boss 429 is the Mustang chapter of that same story. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The next case file involves a car that a manufacturer built, buried, and then spent decades pretending never existed.